This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Wherever thou art in the world, we are speaking to you this morning. I'm speaking to you from my office in the barn, up in the hills of Grey County. And I have with me Sarah Benton. She's our co-host. I think in actual fact, she's more than a co-host. In fact, people have said, Sarah, you better hear this.
Uh-oh.
They said, thank goodness you've got got Sarah on the line. And I said, oh, what's your reason? Because when you misspeak, she always puts you right.
Oh, there we go.
So there we go. To our listening audience, this is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I am the voice of Respectonomics, and we're bringing you a message under the heading of the living asset. The living asset, of course, describes the human being. What I want to do, though, first, Sarah, is make sure that everybody understands. We are now into well over 100 of these podcasts and these presentations. And we want to make it clear, these are available in the sense of in workshops, presentations, speeches, consultations, private or public, but we can do these things. And I think people should be, and particularly those in the management ranks, should be looking now to us to bring us into their mix on a very physical basis. The reason is that the world is being pulled and pushed and stressed in so many different ways. And it is time to be able to collate all the remarkable strengths that the human being has in every corporation and to bring these to a very successful conclusion. It's time, in other words, it's time to get Respectonomics in front of people. Yes?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I didn't misspeak, did I?
No, you did not.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'll let you know.
Okay. I know you will. I know. It's called it's called the dragon in the background.
Mm,
Anyway, Sarah, this morning our message is called, the title is called The Kleenex Factor. And I think most people know what Kleenex is. Some people will call them tissues and this kind of stuff, but Kleenex is a sort of fairly good generic expression. And the
right.
Kleenex factor sort of states the following, that if you ask somebody to pass you a Kleenex, which we have all done in one shape or form, you and I will agree on one point, particularly, and that is you expect the Kleenex to be offered to you cleanly. You offer it maybe even comes in in the box so you can draw out the one you want, but it is all under the heading of you expect the Kleenex to be clean. Yes?
One would hope.
One would hope. And in fact, when you're talking with children and whoever it would be, the rebels in society, that a dirty Kleenex is actually really rather nasty. So I think we've got that as a point that has been made. Here is the issue. Many leaders in business today
Hmm.
look for a Kleenex from their subordinates. They say, pass me my quarterly results, pass me the information on whatever's going on in the product line, the service lines, and whatever they might be, the new revenues and so on. But bring it to me clean. I don't want to have any dirt in the message. In other words, I want all the message to be sanitized. And, you know, to the extent that humanly we like to get a clean Kleenex, I think that the CEO or the manager makes a very good point. They don't want to be given dirt all the time. It's
Hmm.
a fair point.
Fair.
However, and here's where we get into the big however. As George Bernard Shaw said, anything that precedes the word but is a lie. So what we have to do
Mm.
here is look at what is it, though, that creates this Kleenex opportunity. And we have to look at something very important in our own humanity. Our own humanity is a very good litmus test or a very good allegory, if you will, or a metaphor for the corporation. We've repeatedly said the word corporation is based on your favorite subject, Latin, and it's based on the word corpus, which means a body. So if
Hmm.
I look at my body, it's a reasonable expectation, it's a reasonable translation to look at the corporation as a human body. After all, the corporation is made up of what? Many bodies? I think that's reasonable.
Mhm.
But here's the point. You and I suspect I speak for the rich world or the Western world anyway, and that is to say that we will go for annual checkups with our doctors.
Yes.
I think that's a reasonable part of the human
Or
experience.
we should.
We should, and that's what I want you to. You can say that word 98 times in this discussion.
Hmm.
We should go for checkups. But
Right.
let's think about the checkup for a second. And that is, the first thing is we recognize it as an annual requirement, and it's common sense. Now, in order for that to happen, you have to, what's the word, schedule it. You have to have a note in your diary. What I've noticed is that a lot of the medical, what do you call it, industry, medical business,
Hmm.
they actually keep records of when you were last in, and they will get hold of you and say, it's time for your checkup. So it does happen. It's not just the
Right.
responsibility of me, the patient, it's also the doctor will also come to me and say, it's time for your checkup. It actually happened to me quite recently, and it was a 9-year checkup. Can you
Mm,
imagine? They said they did the test, was it 9 years ago? And then it said, don't need to see you for 9 years, and called me to say the 9 years are up.
that's good
So,
diarization, if that is a verb.
very good diarization. I didn't know there was such a word as diarization, but we'll let that one pass today. Sarah, you're making, though, the whole point. It is a diary, it is a scheduled activity. And the reason this is important is that the CEO, and I'm going to use CEO as the acronym for management generally, but the CEO needs to be doing an annual checkup on the people who report to him or her.
Hmm.
In other words, go and do an annual checkup. Now, if you do an annual checkup, think of the annual checkup with your doctor. There are several things that happen. One of them is that prior to the consultation, often the doctor or the assistant will ask you to provide some basic information. Have you changed your drugs? Have you changed this? Have you had any accidents? Whatever it might be. So, with all of that in mind, there's a sense of being prepared then for the consultation. Fine. But here's the real point. Do you know of any medical checkup in reality that can take place without you being in front of the doctor, face to face, person to person? Have you ever heard of a checkup realistically taking place without you being in the presence of the doctor, in other words? I can't think of one.
It happens.
It does?
Uh, I
I,
think there were times or circumstances where it's had to happen.
oh, okay. Okay. That's an important, what do you call it? Not a diversion, but an alternative. But the reality is, if we put it into percentages, would you say 90% of the time, 95% of the
Sure.
time, we need to be physically person to
Yeah.
person? Yeah. And this is a key point. And that is, I said to a member of our Dignity Trust, our Brain Trust, I said, when you go and see the doctor, and he stopped me in his tracks, and he said, I don't go and see the doctor. The doctor comes to see me, which is in today's world, that is by every definition unusual. But what was critical was that was his first response. The
Hmm.
doctor came to see him. And in that particular milieu, that kind of parallel, what the employee is saying is, yes, the CEO comes to see me. And that's a very important part of this annual checkup. So not
Hmm.
only are we talking about the physicality of person to person, we're also talking about the way in which it takes place, which is that the CEO, the manager, goes to the employee. Just like David said, no, the doctor comes to see me. It's an important dynamic. Then the next thing is this. I said to David, well, what does the doctor say to you? And there are two answers he gave me. One is, how are you? Because David actually has some issues. So therefore, this is strictly dealing with those problems. But he's also had an occasion where the doctors looked at him and just said, so what's your problem? And he doesn't mean that in a deprecating kind of way, but
Right.
just like, tell me something new that's happening. That I don't think would be a very cool way for a manager to talk to an employee and say, what's your problem? But what would happen if instead the manager were to sit down with the employee and were to say, what are our problems? In other words, accepting that there are problems, there always are, but
Hmm.
secondly, taking a conjunctive responsibility. In other words, it's not the employee's fault. It is something that where there's a shared responsibility. The word our is a very valuable word. We use it, you and I use it a lot
Hmm.
because it demonstrates the extent of the breadth of support we have. So when we talk about the supervisor, manager saying, what are our problems? It's a wonderful way to open up the subject to the employee being able to say, my screen is off from whatever hour to whatever hour, or, and talk about some of the things that are going on. But that is what the doctor said, didn't he? The doctor said to you, what are your problems? And here we are getting these problems out into the open. And the other thing is, when you have your doctor's visit, we all go there with a certain degree of trepidation. I mean, I think we always say to ourselves, what's the doctor going to find this time? So it's a little bit of an intimidating experience. But you also know intellectually, and maybe even more deeply than that, you know the doctor's doing something incredibly useful, which is identifying something that can be preempted. There is not a medical system in the world that doesn't say, get starting when the issue is small, we can deal with it. When it gets big, we can't, or it's very difficult. So the doctor has this wonderful way of identifying and isolating what seems to be a small issue and being able to deal with it on the spot at the time.
Hmm.
That's why we encourage people to go for annual checkups to see if there's something lurking in the background somewhere. So the whole point of this annual checkup is that the manager, the CEO, the supervisor needs to be engaging in an annual checkup to be able to go there with the premise of they're in there to look for information. This isn't going in there and saying, this is what I think. I mean, did
Hmm.
the doctor ever sit you down and say, let me tell you about what's going on in the world of, something, something? No, the doctor's interested in you. And the CEO needs to express that same interest in you as an employee.
Right. And
So,
I think
sorry, your turn.
if I can share, I think there are a lot of companies in my experience that do an annual checkup, if you will. So, I mean, obviously there's the proverbial annual performance appraisal or
Right.
review. Often, what should happen is ahead of that is bring forward what the employee is looking to speak about as well, right, in
Hmm.
preparation. So it's not just about feedback about them, but
Yeah.
opportunity for back and forward dialogue. I
Right.
do think a lot of companies, I'm not sure to what extent all of them do, but just again through experience, companies will do surveys, if you will,
Hmm.
annually to take a temperature or a gauge of how they're performing, how they're doing, what are the areas that are available
Right.
for improvement, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. I think the key is there's a difference. It's like motivational speaking or a coaching locker room, right? You can have the
Mm.
motivational words on the wall, that's great, but are you implementing it? So very similar to companies or businesses taking a survey. That's great. You're getting data and you're getting information
Yeah.
and input and feedback from the employees and your management staff. It's what are you doing with that information?
Well, can I sort of segue on that? Because
Hmm.
when I go and see the optometrist, their office calls me 2 or 3 days before,
Right.
partly to remind me there's going to be a consultation, and then to go through a few questions. Has my eyesight done this, that, or the other? Have I changed my prescription glasses? Anything like that. That is the survey. So when I go there, yes, they know more about me. That is absolutely for sure,
Right.
and more about my needs. But again and again, that whole concept of the survey, its reality or its implementation only becomes realistic when I'm sitting in front of the optometrist.
Mm.
The optometrist can't very well call me at home and say, listen, we'll do some eye tests on you there.
Right.
No, I have to go there. And I'm pointing to this very important one-on-one formula. And it's a one-on-one formula. People will say to me, and you've heard this one, oh, we haven't got time to do that. Well, there's ways of delegating this particular idea of being one-on-one anyway. But there's another thing. A lot of what we're talking about is built into an attitude.
Mm,
It's not just, I mean, the surveys, as you know from your experience and certainly mine,
mhm,
the surveys tend to be rather clinical. They tend to be antiseptic. They tend to be from the company's point of view, not from the employee's point of view. They often fail to ask, how are you feeling? What are your problems? What are our problems? They don't actually ask those questions. They come into that sort of parachuting, that idea of tell us what you enjoy about your job. And there's nothing wrong
mm,
with that. But we do need this. I can't overemphasize that the human being neurally is made up for one-on-one contact.
mhm,
The more screens we put in between, the more surveys we put in between, the more distance we put between one human being and another, the less likely we are going to have a successful result. That's just the neural connection, the way that the human being
mhm,
operates. We are
mhm.
designed to be in communion with one another. I mean, there's nothing terribly new about that. It's anthropological.
Right.
So I think that's the first thing I want to emphasize is the idea of doing an annual checkup. And what I find interesting about a checkup is how often have you heard this? The doctor will say to you, I think I've seen something. I am sending you to a specialist.
Right.
And that is totally appropriate. The doctor at that point isn't saying, I've got all the answers. I'm not expecting the CEO, the supervisor to have all the answers. But I do expect them to know, to be aware of a problem, to think of a way in which it can be resolved by another individual or organization, whatever is necessary. Now, there's one other thing. Gets into very awkward language. That is, when we're having these discussions with employees, you know, and I know, you're always going to find out things about their, when I say personal life, things
Mhm.
about in their lives that fall outside of the, what you might call the corporate parameter. We know that. But here's the point. Every corporation will say, well, that's your job. You have to fix that. It's almost like the doctor saying, well, if you've got that issue, you'll have to go and fix it yourself. That's a way. But one of the things in the corporation that's terribly important is that the supervisor, the manager, the CEO, they are responsible for a body of people by definition. And if you're responsible to a body of people, you need also to understand that when somebody is having a difficulty, whatever it might be, you may not be Mr. or Mrs. Solution, but what you do need to do is to find out whether that particular issue is likely to be influencing, disrupting, influencing somehow the performance and the activities of the other people in that organization. Because if it is, it needs to be addressed. In other words, if somebody is, I mean, we've become far more sensitive about alcoholism. But if somebody is exhibiting the traits of alcoholism, do we say, oh, that's your business? Or do we recognize that that alcoholism could have a very dangerous influence, disruption on fellow employees?
Mhm.
And the answer is they're both correct. There's a responsibility of the individual, the accountability, but there's also the accountability to the whole, the wholeness, if you will, of the corporation that needs to recognize that people do have these other issues.
1,000%. And I think outside situations or circumstances do it'd be hard to think that they couldn't permeate into our work life or impact our work life or our
Exactly.
productivity or our engagement or things
Yeah.
like that. And so I think that falls on the responsibility of the corporations or the businesses in order to ensure that the management or the team leads or what have you are properly equipped and provided with the right teaching, training, and I don't mean specifically to manage or deal with
Right.
that, but to have an understanding of, to be aware enough to
Right.
identify
Yeah.
or have comfortable dialogue with those individuals if that's being raised or even raising, things that you're
Yeah.
noticing. but then to also have a good understanding of the tools and the resources that I would say I'd like to think 99% of companies do have in place in order to help support that employee and help them engage in those other support systems that would help them. So I do think that's a role and responsibility of the managers to have a good understanding of what is in place, employee support programs, in order to be able to provide that and articulate that with the individuals that they're speaking with. So that boils down to training.
I think you're right. And I think that that training that you're talking about has to be very sensitive. It has to be very one-on-one. I
Mm.
don't think it's something you can learn from a video screen, for
Well, I think
example.
just like I say, having if you have an employee assistance program,
Yeah,
understanding what that program involves or covers.
exactly.
So
Yeah,
again, if
yeah,
something comes up in topic, you're able to support that individual by saying, the
right,
company or we have access to these
right.
types of programs.
Yeah.
Here's the contact information, that sort of thing.
Sarah, I think these points are becoming more and more important. We've heard about quiet quitting. We're now into, can't remember the exact expression, but it's to do with where people feel so overwhelmed, so divided, so isolated, so lonely that in actual fact their performance is not only at issue, so is also their overall health. And the consequences of that are horrific. So that,
Mhm.
in other words, what we're talking about isn't just a sort of good corporate practice. It's a
Right.
practice of recognizing the incredible importance of combining our strengths one to one. I just want to conclude with one other thing, if I may, Sarah, please. We've talked about the doctor's visit on a corporate level. We're going to be doing this is going to be one of 3 or 4 episodes because we're going to be looking at this doctor's approach, this annual checkup approach for customers, suppliers, shareholders, financial resources, all of the parts that come into the corporation, into business life. We're going to be examining it through this filter of the annual checkup and
Hmm.
what goes on. May I ask you one thing, and that is, I have a doctor. I don't see her very often, but I have an implicit trust in her. She is non-judgmental, she's always helpful, she's there when I need her, and so on. And I think most people that I talk to would say, yep, that's the relationship I have with my doctor. Fair enough? Is that fair?
Yes.
And I'm only asking that that same sense of relationship be the same one that the employee has with the chief executive officer. Is that fair?
It is fair. I think the challenge there is it might be a representative of the CEO, depending on the size of the
That's fine.
corporation,
Yeah,
right?
that's fine. I don't, when
Yeah.
I go and see my, a good example, I go and see my doctor. I would say whatever percentage of the time, my issue is dealt with by her assistant.
Hmm.
That doesn't take away from
Right.
the loyalty or the trust, the confidence I have in the doctor. As a matter of fact, it might even be an expression of that. So I don't think we have to say the CEO, but
Hmm.
again and again, I think what's happening here is when you have an attitude of looking after people, it permeates the whole. People say that trite line, trees die from the top. What a
Hmm.
lovely idea that trees live from the top as well.
Right.
Can I say it?
Of course you can.
Oh, Sarah, thank you. I rest my case.
Thank you, Jeremy.
No, we rest our case. That's better.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Sarah.